At my sister's engagement party in New York, my mom asked me to clear the dishes. Make yourself useful since you came empty-handed, she said. Just as I was cleaning, the groom's father walked into the kitchen, stopped, put his hand on his chest and said, "Ma'am, I sat in your courtroom 2 years ago. I think it is time everyone in that dining room knows who is doing the dishes right now." My name is Caroline. I am 34 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful New York State Supreme Court justice, I escaped their toxicity long ago, but maintained occasional contact to keep the peace. Last Saturday, they invited me to my younger sister's lavish engagement party. Between the champagne toasts and caviar, my mother handed me an apron. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in a status-obsessed household meant that money and appearances dictated your value. My parents, Brenda and Richard, operated a logistics company that was heavily leveraged, though they pretended we possessed generational wealth. Because I chose public service over corporate greed, they treated me as the ultimate family failure. They had no idea I had been appointed to the highest commercial court in the state. To them, I was just a low-level government clerk pushing papers for a pathetic salary. The engagement party was held at a massive rented estate in the Hamptons. When I pulled my modest sedan up to the valet stand surrounded by imported luxury sports cars, the judgment began before I even reached the front door. The house was an absurd display of fake wealth. Massive floral arrangements spilled over marble columns, and a live jazz quartet played on the sweeping back terrace. I took a deep breath, smoothing the skirt of my simple black dress, and knocked on the heavy oak door. I carried a $200 bottle of imported French wine, a peace offering to celebrate my sister Brittany marrying into the prominent Jefferson family. My mother yanked the door open. There was no hug, no warm greeting, not even a simple hello. Her eyes immediately darted up and down my outfit, her mouth twisting into a familiar sneer of disappointment. "You actually wore that," Brenda scoffed, keeping her voice low so the wealthy guests behind her would not hear. "I told you this was a black tie event, Caroline. You look like you are heading to a funeral or a shift at a diner." I forced a polite smile and held out the bottle. "I brought this to celebrate Brittany and Terrence." "Congratulations, Mom." Brenda snatched the bottle from my hands, squinting at the label before rolling her eyes. She practically shoved it back at my chest. "Are you kidding me with this grocery store trash? We are serving the Jeffersons tonight. Do you really think I am going to serve them a cheap bottle from a government worker on a miserable salary? Hide this away before someone sees it and thinks we are destitute." I stepped inside, the loud chatter and clinking glasses of the party washing over me. I looked around for my sister, hoping to at least offer my congratulations before retreating to a quiet corner. But Brenda grabbed my forearm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. She pulled me away from the grand foyer and dragged me down a narrow hallway toward the catering kitchen. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to pull my arm free. "I just got here. I have not even seen Brittany yet." "You are not going out there to mingle," Brenda hissed, pushing me through the swinging kitchen doors. "The catering company sent 2 servers home sick today. We are severely understaffed. The Jeffersons are used to perfection, and I will not let your lazy presence ruin your sister's chance at a billionaire lifestyle." She reached onto a stainless steel prep counter, grabbed a stained white catering apron, and shoved it against my chest. "Put this on," Brenda commanded. "You are going to collect the dirty appetizer plates and wash them in the sink. Keep your head down, do not speak to the guests, and for heaven's sake do not tell anyone you are related to the bride. If the Jeffersons find out my oldest daughter is a low-income civil servant who cannot even afford a decent car, they will cancel the wedding. Make yourself useful, since you brought nothing of value to this family." I stood frozen in the middle of the bustling kitchen. Catering staff rushed past me carrying trays of oysters and truffles. I looked at the stained apron in my hands, the sheer audacity of her demand rendering me momentarily speechless. I was a Supreme Court justice. I handed down rulings that dictated the fate of multinational corporations. Yet here, in my mother's eyes, I was merely free labor to protect her fragile ego. I could have walked out right then. I could have dropped the apron, walked back to my car, and driven back to the city. But a lifetime of conditioning, of trying to keep the peace and avoid a catastrophic public meltdown from my mother, kept my feet planted on the tile floor. I told myself it was just one night. One night of playing the obedient, invisible daughter, and then I could return to my real life. I silently tied the apron around my waist and stepped up to the massive industrial sink. The hot water scalded my hands as I began rinsing the fine china that the servers dumped beside me. The sounds of laughter and celebration drifted in from the dining room, a stark contrast to the humid, suffocating heat of the kitchen. I scrubbed the plates mechanically, swallowing the bitter pill of my family's relentless disrespect. About an hour into my unexpected shift, the kitchen door swung open with a violent thud. I did not turn around, assuming it was another waiter bringing more dishes, but the heavy scent of expensive floral perfume told me exactly who had entered. Brittany strutted into the kitchen. She looked radiant, practically dripping in diamonds, wearing a custom designer gown that Brenda had proudly announced cost $10,000. She stopped right behind me, the rustling of her silk skirts loud even over the running water. "Look at you!" Brittany laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that bounced off the stainless steel walls. "Mom said she put you to work, but I had to see it to believe it. You actually look like you belong back here." I turned off the faucet and turned to face her, wiping my wet hands on the apron. "Congratulations on your engagement, Brittany. You look beautiful tonight." She ignored my compliment completely. She held a stack of dirty, half-eaten appetizer plates in her hands. With a wicked smirk, she leaned forward and carelessly tossed the heavy stack directly into the stainless steel sink right in front of me. The plates crashed loudly, water and cocktail sauce splashing up onto my clean black dress and my face. "Oops," Brittany said, not sounding sorry at all. "Wash those carefully, Caroline. They are vintage crystal. If you drop one, your pathetic little government paycheck for the entire year will not be enough to pay me back. Try not to ruin my perfect night with your miserable poor energy." Through the small circular glass window of the swinging kitchen doors, I watched my sister strut back into the grand foyer. The string quartet shifted their melody, signaling the arrival of the guests of honor. The heavy oak front doors swung wide open, and the atmosphere in the room instantly transformed. Terrence Jefferson stepped inside. At 31, my future brother-in-law carried himself with the effortless confidence of a man raised in elite circles. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit his tall, athletic frame perfectly. Behind him walked his parents, Warren and Yvonne Jefferson. They were African-American real estate billionaires, a power couple whose influence stretched across the entire eastern seaboard. Yvonne looked immaculate in a subtle emerald gown, while Warren possessed a quiet, intimidating authority that commanded absolute respect from the moment he entered a room. The contrast between the two families was nauseating. My parents, Richard and Brenda, practically tripped over their own feet, rushing to greet them. Richard forcefully pumped Warren's hand, laughing far too loudly at a greeting I could not hear. Brenda hovered around Yvonne, fawning over her jewelry and offering exaggerated compliments that reeked of desperation. My parents were drowning in debt, desperately clinging to the illusion of high society, and the Jeffersons were their ultimate lifeline. I stood behind the kitchen door, wiping the sticky cocktail sauce off my cheek with the back of my hand. I watched my mother gesture wildly toward the dining room, guiding her billionaire guests toward the champagne tower. But as she turned, her eyes locked with mine through the small glass window. Pure panic flashed across Brenda's face. Her smile vanished instantly. She muttered an excuse to Yvonne, pivoted on her expensive heels, and marched directly toward the kitchen. I stepped back from the door, expecting her to barge in and deliver another list of demeaning demands. Instead, she grabbed the heavy brass handles from the outside and pulled the doors firmly shut. A second later, I heard the heavy metallic sound of a deadbolt sliding into place. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It did not budge. My own mother had just locked me inside the catering kitchen from the outside. Through the thick wood, her muffled voice hissed a warning. Stay exactly where you are. Do not make a sound. Do not show your face. If the Jeffersons see my daughter looking like a destitute servant, they will think we are a family of failures. You will ruin this marriage with your pathetic clerk status. I let go of the handle, the cold brass slipping from my fingers. The sheer cruelty of the act washed over me, but I did not shed a single tear. This was who they were. This was who they had always been. I walked back to the industrial sink, the harsh fluorescent lights humming above me. I picked up a soapy sponge and began scrubbing a crystal platter. My mother locking me away like a dirty secret was the exact reason I had never revealed my true profession to them. For years, my family assumed I was a low-level government paper pusher making a meager salary and living a mediocre life. They mocked my decision to enter public service instead of joining a ruthless corporate law firm. Richard once told me that working for the state was a refuge for people too weak to survive in the real business world. I never corrected them. I never told them that my years of relentless hard work had culminated in being appointed as a New York State Supreme Court justice. I never mentioned that I presided over multi-million-dollar commercial fraud cases or that powerful executives trembled when they stood before my bench. If Brenda and Richard knew the truth, they would have weaponized my position immediately. They would have paraded my title around to secure shady business loans or demanded legal favors to save their failing logistics company. Keeping my identity hidden was my armor. Letting them believe I was a nobody was the only way I could protect my peace and maintain absolute professional integrity. I scrubbed another plate, the hot water steaming around my wrists. I was a judge who commanded absolute respect in the courtroom, yet here I was locked in a kitchen, scrubbing leftover caviar off expensive china so my sister could secure her billionaire groom. The injustice was almost poetic, but my patience had an expiration date. I reached for a towel to dry my hands, intending to find a back exit through the service hallway. But before I could take a step, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the hum of the refrigerators. My cell phone resting on the stainless steel prep counter began to vibrate wildly. It was not a standard text message chime. It was a persistent, aggressive alarm, the kind reserved for critical emergencies. I picked up the device. The screen was flashing bright red. It was an urgent alert from the federal banking system, a high-level notification tied directly to my secure Social Security number. I stared at the screen, my heart slamming against my ribs. The notification read in bold, black letters. Alert. Your commercial loan of $500,000 is severely past due. Immediate legal action is pending. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin to breathe. $500,000. I stared at the terrifying number, the glowing red screen illuminating the dark reality of my situation. I had never taken out a commercial loan in my life. My flawless credit score, carefully maintained over a decade of public service, was my most protected financial asset. Someone had bypassed multiple security protocols to secure $500,000 under my name. The notification demanded immediate verification to avoid federal seizure of assets. The red warning light pulsed on my screen like a ticking bomb, and in that suffocating locked kitchen, the puzzle pieces began to snap together in my mind with horrifying clarity. The glowing red screen of my phone illuminated the dim corners of the catering kitchen. I stared at the digital alert, my mind instantly shifting from the shock of a betrayed daughter to the razor-sharp calculation of a New York State Supreme Court justice. The notification was not a simple banking error. It was an official alert from a federal credit monitoring system. A commercial loan of $500,000 under my name had officially entered default status. I read the words again. $500,000. The sheer magnitude of the number made the humid air in the kitchen feel suffocating. I had never taken out a commercial loan in my life. My personal finances were an impenetrable fortress. As a high-ranking judicial official, maintaining a flawless credit score and a spotless financial record was not just a personal choice. It was a strict professional requirement. Any hint of financial instability could trigger an ethics investigation or compromise my position on the bench. Someone had bypassed multiple layers of security to secure $500,000 using my credentials. They needed my social security number. They needed my employment history. They needed forged signatures on binding federal documents. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was a highly orchestrated, premeditated felony. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. I looked through the small glass window of the kitchen doors toward the extravagant engagement party happening in the grand foyer. Richard and Brenda, my parents. Their logistics company had been hemorrhaging money for years. Every time we spoke, which was rare, they complained about denied credit lines, aggressive creditors, and the looming threat of bankruptcy. Yet tonight they were hosting a six-figure engagement party at a rented estate in the Hamptons. They had purchased a $10,000 custom gown for Brittany. They had hired a live jazz quartet, ordered premium imported caviar, and poured endless bottles of expensive champagne for 200 elite guests. They were flat broke, yet they were spending money like royalty. They had funded this entire illusion of wealth by stealing my identity. They had used my pristine credit history built over a decade of dedicated public service to secure a massive commercial loan. They had essentially mortgaged my entire future, my career, and my freedom just to throw a lavish party and impress the billionaire Jefferson family. They sacrificed me so Brittany could secure her wealthy groom. A cold, methodical fury replaced the initial shock. The kind of fury I usually reserved for the arrogant corporate criminals who stood trial in my courtroom. I pocketed my phone. The decades of playing the obedient, invisible daughter were officially over. I was done keeping the peace. I was done swallowing their disrespect to maintain a fake family image. I marched toward the heavy oak doors that separated the catering kitchen from the dining room. I did not care about the soft jazz music floating through the air. I did not care about the clinking crystal glasses or the hushed conversations of the New York elite. I did not even care about the powerful Warren Jefferson standing out there. My parents had crossed a line that led straight to federal prison. I raised my fist and hammered against the solid wood. I did not knock politely. I pounded on the door with the heavy rhythmic force of a gavel striking a sounding block. The loud, aggressive thuds echoed over the running water of the industrial sink. "Open this door!" I demanded, raising my voice loud enough to be heard over the party chatter outside. "Open this door right now, or I will break it off its hinges." I slammed my fist against the wood again. The anger coursing through my veins made me oblivious to the stinging pain in my knuckles. I was ready to walk straight into that dining room covered in dishwater and cocktail sauce and drag my parents out in front of their billionaire guests. The lock clicked. The deadbolt slid back with a sharp metallic snap. The heavy door swung inward. I braced myself to confront Brenda, ready to demand a full confession for the felony committed in my name. I was ready to unleash the full authority of my position. But it was not my mother standing in the doorway. A large, heavy hand clamped violently over my shoulder. Before I could speak a single word, my father Richard threw his entire body weight against me. He shoved me backward with a brutal, aggressive force, sending me stumbling across the slippery kitchen tiles. I caught my balance against the stainless steel prep counter just as Richard stepped fully into the kitchen. He grabbed the brass handles and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind him, cutting off the sounds of the party. He did not look like a father caught committing a catastrophic financial crime. He did not look guilty or ashamed. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged, and his eyes were dark with a threatening predatory hostility. He took a slow, deliberate step toward me, trapping me between his imposing frame and the industrial sink. "Keep your voice down," Richard hissed, his face inches from mine, as he pinned me against the edge of the industrial sink. "Do you have any idea how much money is sitting in that dining room right now? You are going to ruin everything we have built." I did not cower. I stood tall, the wet apron strings digging into my back, and held up my phone. The red warning notification cast a harsh, unforgiving glare between us. $500,000, Richard. A commercial loan originated 3 weeks ago using my social security number. The bank is demanding immediate payment. Explain this right now. I expected him to pale. I expected him to stutter, to beg for forgiveness, or at least show a flicker of parental guilt for committing a catastrophic federal offense against his own flesh and blood. Instead, he let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. He adjusted the lapels of his tailored tuxedo, a tuxedo he had undoubtedly purchased using my stolen identity. "Oh, so the bank finally sent the notice," he said, waving his hand as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "I told Brenda we should have intercepted your mail better, but those digital banking alerts are impossible to bypass these days." "Do not be so dramatic, Caroline. It is just a temporary line of credit." "A temporary line of credit?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You committed identity theft. You forged my signature on federal lending documents. That is not a line of credit. That is a felony." Richard crossed his arms over his chest, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "Lower your voice and listen to me. Your mother and I did what we had to do. The logistics company is completely underwater. We have been running on fumes for 2 years. Every commercial bank in the tri-state area laughed in my face when I applied for a bridge loan. My credit is completely shot. Your mother's credit is shot. But you—" He pointed a thick, accusatory finger at my chest. "You have a pristine 820 credit score because you sit at a safe, boring government desk all day playing by the rules." The sheer audacity of his confession was staggering. He was not confessing to a crime. He was justifying a necessary business transaction. "So you stole my identity to throw a party," I said, looking around the catering kitchen at the remnants of expensive champagne and imported truffles that surrounded us. "You took out $500,000 under my name to rent a Hamptons estate so you could pretend you are wealthy. It is an investment." Richard snapped, his eyes flashing with irritation at my lack of understanding. "Brittany is marrying Terrence Jefferson. Do you understand who the Jeffersons are? Warren Jefferson could buy our entire logistics company with the loose change in his couch cushions. We had to match their lifestyle. We had to throw a $150,000 engagement party to prove we belong in their elite circle. We had to buy Brittany a dowry, designer gowns, a lifestyle that Terrence would accept. If they knew we were bankrupt, they would pull the plug on this wedding immediately. And when the bank comes after me for $500,000, I asked, the sheer legal magnitude of his stupidity crystallizing in my mind. What was your brilliant investment strategy for my ruined financial life?" Richard rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed by my lack of cooperation. "You are missing the big picture, Caroline. Once Brittany marries Terrence, the Jeffersons will officially be family. Warren will bail out my company. I will pay off your little loan in 6 months. Nobody gets hurt. You just need to hold off the bank for a little while. Tell them there was a clerical error." I stared at the man who contributed half my DNA. He was actively asking a New York State Supreme Court justice to commit bank fraud to cover up his aggravated identity theft. The layers of criminality were piling up so high it was almost comical. "You mortgaged my life," I said, my voice steady and deadly calm. "You stole my financial future so your golden child could play pretend with billionaires." "Stop acting like a victim," Richard growled, stepping closer, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. "I paid for the food in your mouth for 18 years. I paid for the roof over your head. We raised you. We sacrificed for you. You owe this family. Your credit score belongs to us. You should be honored to help your sister secure a wealthy husband since you clearly cannot manage to find one yourself." He was gaslighting me. It was a textbook psychological manipulation, a tactic I had seen narcissistic defendants use in my courtroom 1,000 times. He wanted me to feel guilty for his crime. He wanted me to believe that my pristine financial record was a family asset he had the ultimate right to harvest. "You are 34 years old," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension and cruelty. "You have no husband. You have no children. You work a dead-end government job. Your life is going nowhere. Brittany is the future of this family. Her marriage to Terrence is our only way out of bankruptcy. The least you can do is shut your mouth, wash these dishes, and take the financial hit for the greater good." Every word out of his mouth was a nail in the coffin of our relationship. There was no love here. There was no parental instinct. To Richard and Brenda, I was not a daughter. I was a resource. I was a scapegoat they could slaughter on the altar of Brittany's social climbing ambitions. They honestly believed I was a weak, powerless clerk who would fold under their pressure. They thought they could bully me into silent submission. They thought I would simply absorb a $500,000 debt and risk federal prosecution just to protect their fragile, fake empire. They did not know they were threatening a woman who sent ruthless corporate executives to federal prison before her morning coffee. I did not cry. I did not scream. The emotional daughter died in that kitchen, leaving only the cold, calculating magistrate behind. The law was absolute. The law did not care about family loyalty. The law did not care about Hampton's engagement parties or billionaire in-laws. "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice cutting through the humid air like a scalpel. I reached into the deep pocket of my black dress. I did not pull out a dish towel. I pulled out my cell phone, gripping it tightly in my hand. "What are you doing?" Richard demanded, his eyes narrowing as he watched my thumb unlock the screen. "I am doing what any responsible citizen does when they discover a massive financial crime," I replied, staring directly into his furious eyes. "I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You just confessed to wire fraud and identity theft. I suggest you enjoy the caviar out there, Richard. It will be the last decent meal you eat before you are arraigned in federal court." The heavy oak door swung inward again, striking the edge of the stainless steel prep counter with a sharp bang. Brittany marched into the suffocating heat of the catering kitchen. The thick silk of her custom designer gown dragged violently across the wet floor tiles, but she did not seem to care. Her face, usually carefully composed into a mask of affluent perfection, was twisted into a petulant, ugly scowl. She had clearly been lingering in the hallway, listening to every word of my confrontation with our father. I expected her to express shock. I expected her to turn to Richard and demand to know why he had jeopardized my life for a party. But in our family, accountability was a foreign concept, and I was the eternal scapegoat. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Brittany shrieked, aiming her fury entirely at me. "I can hear you threatening Dad from the hallway. Keep your voice down. Do you want Warren and Yvonne to hear you ranting like a lunatic? Do you want Terrence to walk out that door and cancel everything?" I stared at my younger sister. The massive diamond engagement ring Terrence had given her caught the harsh fluorescent light flashing brilliantly as she crossed her arms over her chest. She stood there dripping in stolen wealth, defending the very crime that had funded her entire charade. "Did you know about this?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Did you know they stole my social security number to fund this engagement party?" Brittany rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh as if I were a toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Caroline. It is just some paperwork. Dad said he would handle the payments. You are acting like a complete sociopath over a minor inconvenience." "A minor inconvenience?" I repeated, the sheer absurdity of her statement echoing off the tile walls. "Brittany, this is $500,000 in fraudulent commercial debt. It is a federal crime. If I do not report this immediately, I become an accessory to wire fraud. My entire career will be destroyed. I will go to prison." "You do not have a career worth crying over," Brittany snapped, taking a step closer, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You are a low-level government clerk. You stamp papers for a living. Who cares if you lose that pathetic job? You are 34 years old, Caroline. Look at yourself. You live alone. You have no husband. You have absolutely no future worth protecting. This wedding is the only good thing to ever happen to this family, and you are trying to ruin it because you are jealous." The gaslighting was so intense, so deeply ingrained in her psychology, that she genuinely believed her own narrative. She viewed my financial ruin as a necessary stepping stone for her social ascension. "Jealous," I said, maintaining my judicial composure despite the raging fire in my chest. "You think I am jealous of a fraudulent party funded by identity theft?" "Yes," Brittany spat back, her face flushing red with anger. "You have always been jealous of me. You are miserable and alone, and you want me to be miserable too. But I am marrying Terrence Jefferson. I am marrying into a billionaire real estate empire. My life is starting and yours has been over for a decade, so do us all a favor and shut your mouth. Treat that debt as your wedding gift to me." A wedding gift. She wanted me to accept $500,000 of federal loan fraud as a wedding present. The sheer entitlement was breathtaking. I looked from Brittany to Richard, who stood silently by the industrial refrigerators, nodding along in agreement with his golden child. They were a unified front of delusion and criminality. "Let me make this perfectly clear to both of you," I said, gripping my phone tightly. "I am not absorbing your debt. I am not protecting your fake image. I am not sacrificing my life so you can play pretend with the Jefferson family. I am reporting this crime right now." Brittany lunged forward, her pristine manicure dangerously close to my face. "If you make a scene tonight," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely suppressed rage, "if you ruin this party, if the Jeffersons call off this wedding because you threw a tantrum over money, how exactly do you plan to pay us back? Will you pay with your life? Because that is what you will owe me. You will owe me my entire life." She actually believed her threats carried weight. She believed she held the high ground. In her mind, the potential loss of her billionaire groom was a far greater tragedy than my certain incarceration for a crime I did not commit. "Your life is built on a lie, Brittany," I said coldly. "And the Jeffersons despise liars. Warren Jefferson built his empire from the ground up. If he finds out you funded this party by defrauding a bank, Terrence will drop you before the appetizers are cleared. Do not you dare say his name," Brittany screamed, losing the last shred of her carefully curated high society persona. "You are nothing. You are a maid in an apron standing in a kitchen. Terrence loves me. The Jeffersons love me. You are just bitter trash trying to drag me down to your miserable level." There was no reasoning with delusion. There was no negotiating with criminals. I did not need to hear another word. The evidence was irrefutable and the confessions were complete. I looked down at my phone, bypassing the lock screen, and opened the keypad to dial the federal authorities. "I am done talking," I declared, raising the phone toward my ear. Before my thumb could press the call button, the kitchen doors burst open with a violent crash. Brenda charged into the room like a bull seeing red. Her eyes were wide with manic desperation, her expensive heels slipping dangerously on the wet floor. She did not yell. She did not hesitate. She launched her entire body weight at me, reaching out with clawed hands, and forcefully snatched the phone right out of my grip. Brenda's manicured hands clamped down on my wrist with the force of a vice. Before my brain could register the physical assault, she twisted my arm sharply, her acrylic nails digging into my skin. The sudden pain forced my fingers to open and my mobile phone slipped from my grasp. I watched in slow motion as Brenda snatched the device out of midair with predatory speed. She did not hesitate to see who I was calling or what was on the screen. She simply spun around on her expensive designer heels and hurled the phone directly into the deep industrial sink behind me. The heavy device plunged into the murky, grease-filled dishwater with a sickening splash. A few bubbles rose to the surface of the soapy liquid, carrying the faint glow of the red warning notification, before the screen flickered short-circuited and went completely black. My only immediate lifeline to the outside world sank to the bottom of a basin filled with leftover cocktail sauce and discarded lemon wedges. I stared at the dark water, the reality of her destructive act settling over the stifling kitchen. "Are you completely insane?" Brenda hissed, her chest heaving as she backed away from the sink. She smoothed the front of her tailored evening gown, desperately trying to regain her composure, though her eyes remained wild with panic. "You are not calling anyone, Caroline. You are not reporting anything. You are going to stand right here, and you are going to keep your mouth shut." Richard stepped forward, positioning himself beside his wife, a unified wall of parental authority built on a foundation of absolute fraud. Brittany smirked from the corner, crossing her arms in triumph, delighted that our mother had swooped in to silence the family disappointment. "You listen to me very carefully," Brenda commanded, stepping into my personal space. Her expensive floral perfume was cloying, masking the scent of fear sweating from her pores. "We are minutes away from securing a union that will elevate this family to a level of wealth and prestige you cannot even comprehend. We are joining the Jefferson dynasty. I refuse to let a bitter, ungrateful, low-income clerk ruin the greatest triumph of my life over a trivial financial technicality. A trivial financial technicality. That was how my mother described a $500,000 federal wire fraud committed against her future in-laws. You think you hold some kind of power over us because you discovered a piece of paper? Brenda sneered, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You have absolutely nothing. You are a 34-year-old spinster who works a pathetic government desk job. Your salary is an embarrassment. Your apartment is an embarrassment. You have spent your entire adult life achieving absolutely nothing of value. The only useful thing you have ever provided to this family is that pristine credit score, and you should be on your knees thanking us for finally putting it to good use. I remained silent, letting her toxic monologue fill the humid space. Every word she spoke severed another invisible thread that tied me to this family. If you walk out of this kitchen, Brenda threatened, leaning in so close I could see the frantic pulse beating in her neck. If you breathe a single word of this loan to Warren Jefferson or the authorities, you will be dead to us. I will personally ensure that every relative, every family friend, and every professional contact we share cuts you off completely. I will publicly disown you. You will be entirely alone in this world. She paused, letting her ultimate threat hang in the air, fully expecting me to crumble. In her mind, the threat of familial excommunication was the most devastating weapon she possessed. She thought I was a fragile, dependent child terrified of losing her approval. Now Brenda ordered, pointing a rigid finger at the pile of dirty appetizer plates resting on the stainless steel counter. Turn around, put your hands back in that water, and finish cleaning those dishes. Do not take off that apron. Do not step foot in the dining room. You are going to stay hidden in this kitchen, like the help you are, and you are going to let your sister have her perfect night. If you comply, Richard will eventually take care of the bank. If you disobey, you will never see our faces again. The jazz quartet was playing a lively tune out on the terrace, the faint joyful notes bleeding through the thick oak doors. Inside the kitchen, the silence was deafening. Richard puffed his chest out, clearly satisfied with his wife's ruthless handling of the situation. Brittany let out a soft, mocking laugh, already turning her attention to her flawless reflection in a polished metal cabinet. They waited for my submission. They waited for the tears to well up in my eyes. They waited for my shoulders to slump in defeat, for the obedient, invisible daughter to quietly resume her station at the sink and accept her financial execution. But I did not cry. My heart rate, which had spiked when the phone was snatched from my hands, slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. The suffocating heat of the catering kitchen no longer bothered me. A profound, absolute coldness washed over my entire being. The pathetic attempt at intimidation did not break me. It merely bored me. I raised my hands slowly. I did not reach for the dirty plates. Instead, I gripped the cuff of the thick yellow rubber glove encasing my right hand. With a smooth, deliberate motion, I peeled the wet rubber away from my skin. It made a sharp, snapping sound as I dropped it onto the metal counter. I did the same with the left glove, letting it fall beside the first. Brenda frowned her triumphant smirk, faltering slightly at my calm defiance. I told you to wash those dishes, she snapped. I wiped my bare, damp hands on the front of the stained catering apron. I looked at the dark, soapy water where my device had sunk to its watery grave. Then I lifted my gaze and locked eyes with my mother. You have fundamentally misunderstood the situation, I said, my voice resonating with the chilling, authoritative cadence I used to silence hostile defense attorneys. I took a single step forward, forcing Brenda to instinctively step back. The phone you just threw into that sink was not a personal device, I stated, enunciating every syllable with lethal precision. It was a secure, encrypted mobile terminal issued directly by the New York State judicial system. You just destroyed federal government property, and that temporary line of credit you both keep dismissing. That is aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. It is a Class C felony. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I let the weight of the legal statutes crash down upon them. Brenda stared at me, her eyes darting back and forth, trying to process the magnitude of the words I had just spoken. But the delusion was too deep. She let out a loud, mocking scoff, throwing her head back in forced laughter. "A Class C felony," Brenda mocked, clapping her hands together. "Listen to you throwing around legal jargon like you are some kind of hotshot lawyer. You are a clerk, Caroline, a miserable, underpaid secretary. You do not have the power to send anyone to prison. Do you really think anyone in the federal government is going to listen to a nobody like you over wealthy business owners like us?" I did not smile, but a dark sense of anticipation settled deep within my chest. They had no idea. They had absolutely no idea that the trap had already been set, and they had just locked themselves inside it. I did not wait for their response. I simply turned on my heel and pushed through the heavy swinging doors, leaving my parents and sister standing in the humid, foul-smelling kitchen. They probably assumed I was retreating to cry in a bathroom or fleeing to my car in defeat. They severely underestimated the resolve of a woman who spent her days dismantling complex corporate fraud syndicates. The jazz quartet was playing a lively rendition of a classic standard, the sound echoing through the vaulted ceilings of the rented estate. I ignored the wealthy guests dripping in diamonds and holding crystal flutes of expensive champagne. I kept my head down, navigating the perimeter of the grand foyer until I reached the hallway leading to the private quarters. Richard had designated the mahogany-paneled library as his temporary command center for the weekend. I knew this because he had loudly boasted earlier about needing a secure space to handle international shipping crises, which I now knew was just a cover for dodging frantic calls from his creditors. The heavy door to the library was closed, but unlocked. I slipped inside and shut it firmly behind me, plunging the room into a heavy, suffocating silence. The space smelled of expensive cigars and aged leather, a pathetic attempt by my father to emulate the billionaires he so desperately wanted to impress. Sitting on the center of the massive desk was his laptop. I did not need his password. I did not need his permission. As a sitting justice of the New York State Supreme Court, I possessed a level of digital clearance that my father could not even fathom. I reached into the hidden pocket of my black dress and pulled out my keys. Attached to the metal ring was a small, unassuming black plastic rectangle. It was a secure RSA hardware token directly synced to the federal judiciary and state financial monitoring databases. I opened the laptop, bypassed the standard login screen, using a backdoor administrative portal I utilized for reviewing sealed digital evidence, and typed in the rolling 6-digit code from my token. The screen flickered instantly, replacing Richard's generic desktop wallpaper with the stark, highly encrypted interface of the Unified Court System and Financial Crimes Network. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic precision. I was no longer a betrayed daughter. I was an investigator processing a crime scene. I entered my own Social Security number into the query bar, crossing it with the Federal Commercial Lending Registry. The system processed the request for an agonizing few seconds before the screen populated with a glaring new entry. There it was, in black and white. A commercial bridge loan for $500,000 originated exactly 21 days ago. The digital signature attached to the promissory note was a clumsy, rushed imitation of my handwriting. Richard had not even tried to make it look authentic, banking on the fact that I would never check my commercial credit history, because my career strictly prohibited me from taking on unsecured corporate debt. I clicked on the lender details, expecting to see the name of a desperate, high-interest predatory lending institution, a bank that dealt with subprime borrowers and failing logistics companies. But the name listed on the origination document made me freeze. It read, Pinnacle Horizon Capital Partners. The name sounded familiar, but not like a standard commercial bank. I opened a secondary window accessing the state corporate registry to pull the charter for Pinnacle Horizon. I needed to see who the managing directors were who had approved a $500,000 unsecured loan to a woman who had never requested it. The corporate filing loaded instantly. I scanned past the registered agent, past the shell company layer, tracing the holding structure all the way to the top of the pyramid. The primary shareholder and sole corporate owner was listed in bold, undeniable text. Jefferson Global Holdings. My breath caught in my throat. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady while my mother assaulted me in the kitchen, suddenly went cold. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, rereading the corporate structure just to be absolutely certain. There was no mistake. The investment fund that had issued the fraudulent loan did not belong to a random bank. It belonged to Warren Jefferson. It was the private equity arm of the very family my sister was attempting to marry into. The sheer, unadulterated lunacy of my parents' actions crashed down on me. Richard and Brenda had not just committed a federal crime, they had actively, deliberately targeted the billionaire father of the groom. They had used my stolen identity to extract $500,000 from Warren Jefferson's own corporate treasury, and then they had used his own stolen money to buy the expensive champagne he was currently drinking in the next room. They had funded this entire engagement party by defrauding the man they were trying to impress. It was a level of financial suicide so spectacular, so mind-bogglingly reckless, that it defied all logic. They were literally sitting on a ticking time bomb, smiling and shaking hands with the man they had just robbed. I stared at the screen, calculating the legal fallout. Warren Jefferson was a man who destroyed ruthless competitors before breakfast. When he discovered that his future in-laws had breached his investment fund using fraudulent credentials, he would not just cancel the wedding. He would unleash a fleet of corporate attorneys to annihilate them. He would bury Richard and Brenda under so many civil suits and criminal complaints that they would never see the light of day. And because my name was on the dotted line, because my identity had been weaponized, I was standing squarely in the blast radius. I reached for the trackpad, ready to export the documents to a secure server to prepare my own legal defense. I needed to generate the exact IP logs, showing the loan was originated from this very laptop. I needed absolute, irrefutable proof that I was the victim, not the perpetrator, before Warren Jefferson's auditors caught the discrepancy. But before my finger could press the key, the heavy brass doorknob turned with a sharp click. I had not locked the door. The thick mahogany panel swung wide open, casting a long, dark shadow across the Persian rug. I snapped my head up, my hand freezing over the keyboard. Standing in the doorway holding a crystal glass of bourbon was Terrence. His dark eyes immediately bypassed me and locked directly onto the brightly lit computer screen, taking in the unmistakable federal financial documents, the loan amount, and the bold letters of his own family's corporate logo. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut. Terrence stood in the dimly lit library, the amber liquid in his crystal glass catching the faint light from the desk lamp. I stepped away from the laptop, my mind racing to formulate a legal defense. I fully expected him to drop his drink. I expected him to shout for the authorities upon discovering that his future in-laws had systematically defrauded his family investment fund. Instead, Terrence took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon. A cold, chilling smirk spread across his handsome face. He walked toward the desk with the relaxed, predatory stride of a man who held all the cards. "You always were the nosy one," Caroline Terrence said smoothly, his deep voice devoid of any surprise or anger. "I warned Richard that leaving his laptop unattended during a party full of corporate sharks was a bad idea, but your father never listens." I stared at him, my judicial instincts instantly sensing a severe deviation from normal behavior. "You are looking at a commercial bridge loan for $500,000. I stated, keeping my tone perfectly level. "My parents forged my signature to steal from your father's private equity firm. They used your family money to pay for this engagement party." Terrence chuckled softly. He leaned against the edge of the massive desk, crossing his ankles. "I know exactly what that document is, Caroline. I know the origination date. I know the exact interest rate. I even know the routing number of the offshore account where the funds were deposited." He tilted his glass toward me in a mocking toast. "Because I am the one who personally approved the transfer." The air in the library suddenly felt thick and unbreathable. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, forming a picture far more sinister than simple parental greed. Terrence was not a victim, he was a co-conspirator. "You approved a fraudulent loan," I said, narrowing my eyes. "You are the director of investment for Jefferson Global Holdings. You know the federal compliance regulations. You saw a forged signature on a lending document and you pushed it through underwriting anyway." "Oh, I did not just push it through." Terrence corrected a wicked gleam in his dark eyes. "I orchestrated it. Richard came to me 2 months ago practically crying on his knees. His logistics company was bleeding cash. He was terrified of losing the house, terrified of losing face in front of my parents. He begged me for a personal bailout. I told him I do not do charity, but I do make strategic investments. So you taught him how to commit identity theft. I deduced the sheer brazenness of his corruption, making my blood run cold. He was handing me a verbal confession to a masterclass in criminal conspiracy. I simply pointed out that while his credit was garbage, his eldest daughter had a pristine financial record." Terrence smiled, entirely unbothered by his admission of a felony. "I told him if he could produce the right paperwork, I would make sure the compliance department at Pinnacle Horizon looked the other way. It was incredibly easy. My father trusts my judgment, and the underwriters do not question a direct order from the heir to the company." I looked at the man my sister was about to marry. He was wealthy, highly educated, and completely morally bankrupt. Why, I demanded, stepping forward. "Why would you risk federal prosecution to hand $500,000 to a failing businessman? What possible return on investment do you get from funding a fake engagement party?" Terrence let out a dark, booming laugh. "Control, Caroline. Absolute, unquestionable control." He set his glass down on the desk with a sharp clink and stepped into my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the heavy smell of bourbon. "Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to marry a woman from a genuinely wealthy family?" Terrence asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, calculating register. "They come with aggressive prenuptial agreements. They come with demanding fathers and teams of corporate lawyers who scrutinize every single asset. They expect to be treated as equals. I do not want an equal. I want a beautiful, compliant wife who does exactly what she is told." The terrifying reality of his psychological manipulation became crystal clear. He had deliberately trapped my family in a web of financial crime. By holding this fraudulent loan over their heads, you own them. I said, my voice laced with disgust. "You turned my parents into your puppets." "They are my pets," Terrence corrected viciously. "As long as that $500,000 debt is sitting in my desk drawer, Richard and Brenda will never cross me. They will never demand anything from the Jefferson estate. They will smile, they will nod, and they will force Brittany to be the perfect, obedient little bride. If she ever steps out of line, all I have to do is mention the word wire fraud, and her parents go to federal prison. They are bought and paid for." He was a monster wearing a designer suit. He had weaponized my identity to enslave my entire family, and they were too blinded by their own greed to realize they had sold their souls to a tyrant. "You are just as pathetic as they are," I said, my voice steady and unwavering. "You bypassed your own father's strict compliance regulations. Warren Jefferson built his real estate empire on absolute integrity. He fires executives for minor accounting errors. If he finds out you used his corporate treasury to buy yourself a compliant set of in-laws, he will not just strip you of your title, he will disown you." Terrence's smug smile finally vanished. A dangerous, violent shadow crossed his face. He hated being reminded of his father's unwavering moral compass. He hated knowing that his power was entirely dependent on Warren approval. He took another step forward, backing me against the heavy wooden bookshelves. He thought he was intimidating a helpless government clerk. He had no idea he was attempting to threaten a sitting judge of the Supreme Court. "You listen to me very carefully, you miserable little paper pusher," Terrence hissed, all traces of his charming billionaire facade completely gone. You are going to close that laptop, walk out of this room, and keep your mouth shut. You are going to take the fall for this debt, and you are going to let my wedding proceed perfectly. And if I refuse, I challenged, refusing to break eye contact. Terrence leaned in so close I could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him. His voice dropped to a lethal, menacing whisper. If you breathe a single word of this to my father, I will personally see to it that you rot in a federal cell. I will testify that you came to me begging for the money. I will sue you for fraud because the signature on the contract is yours, and with my family legal team backing me, you will not stand a chance. The heavy mahogany door swung open with a violent thud, shattering the tense silence of the library. Brenda, Richard, and Brittany poured into the room, their faces flushed with a mixture of panic and hostility. Brenda immediately reached backward and slid the deadbolt into place, locking us inside. The loud click of the lock sounded exactly like a prison cell slamming shut. They took one look at Terrence standing over me and instantly assessed the situation. I expected at least a fraction of parental instinct to kick in, a momentary hesitation, seeing their eldest daughter threatened by a wealthy outsider. But there was no hesitation. The hierarchy of this family was set in stone. Terrence was the golden goose, and I was the sacrificial lamb. Terrence smoothly adjusted his suit jacket, his menacing demeanor dissolving into a charismatic, predatory smile. He looked at my father and nodded. Your daughter and I were just finalizing the terms of her financial contribution to this union. Richard, I believe you have the necessary paperwork ready. Richard did not look at me. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. He stepped forward and slapped the papers down onto the center of the desk, right next to the glowing laptop screen that still displayed their federal crime. He flattened the creases with the palm of his hand, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. I glanced down at the document. It was a formal, legally binding promissory note. The bold text at the top declared a full confession of debt. The clauses dictated that I, Caroline, explicitly accepted absolute responsibility for the $500,000 commercial bridge loan. It outlined a crippling 20-year repayment plan, indenturing me to Pinnacle Horizon Capital Partners. It was a masterclass in financial entrapment, designed to provide Terrence and his compliance department with a flawless paper trail while legally shackling me to their fraud. You actually drafted a confession? I said, the sheer calculated evil of their plan settling over me like a suffocating blanket. You planned this from the very beginning. You knew you were going to default, and you prepared this document to make me the ultimate fall guy. It is called risk management, Richard stated coldly, tapping his thick index finger against the signature line at the bottom of the page. You are going to sign this document right now. You are going to take legal ownership of this loan, and you are going to make the monthly payments out of your state salary until I decide my company is stable enough to reimburse you. I looked at my mother. Brenda stood with her arms crossed, her eyes hard and devoid of any maternal warmth. Do not look at me like that, she snapped. We gave you life, Caroline. We clothed you, fed you, and tolerated your mediocre existence for 34 years. You have no husband, no children, and no legacy. This is your one chance to actually be useful to the people who raised you. Sign the paper and stop ruining your sister and her special night. Brittany stepped forward, the diamonds on her neck glittering under the desk lamp. Her face was twisted in disgust. You are always so stubborn and difficult. Do you know how embarrassing it is to have a sister who works as a lowly clerk for the government? Terrence is offering us a way to elevate this entire family, and you are being completely selfish. Just sign the stupid paper so we can go back to the party. I will not sign a confession for a federal crime I did not commit, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. This document is a death sentence. If I sign this, I am admitting to wire fraud. I lose my career. I lose my freedom. Then we will take your career anyway, Brenda threatened, stepping into my personal space, her expensive perfume making me nauseous. If you refuse to sign, your father and I will make a phone call to the Human Resources Department of your pathetic state agency first thing Monday morning. Richard nodded, a cruel, triumphant smile spreading across his face. We will file a formal medical report stating that you have suffered a severe violent psychotic break. We will tell your supervisors that you are prone to extreme delusions, financial mania, and pathological lying. We will demand a mandated wellness check and a psychiatric hold. Brittany laughed, a sharp, ringing sound that echoed in the dark library. Good luck keeping your little desk job with a documented mental breakdown on your file. A government clerk loses their security clearance instantly for that kind of instability. Who do you think they will believe, Caroline? A hysterical single 34-year-old paper pusher, or a wealthy, respected business family backed by the billionaire Jefferson Empire? They had weaponized my fake identity against me. Because they believed I was a powerless, easily disposable clerk, they thought a simple character assassination would destroy me entirely. They were completely unaware that attempting to file a false psychiatric report to extort a sitting Supreme Court justice was yet another massive felony they were casually adding to their rap sheet. Terrence stood back, swirling the bourbon in his crystal glass, watching my family execute his dirty work with absolute delight. He did not even have to lift a finger. He had successfully turned my own blood relatives into his personal hit squad. You see, Caroline, Terrence murmured, his voice dripping with dark satisfaction. You are completely isolated. There is no white knight coming to save you. You have no power in this room. You have no power in this world. The physical intimidation escalated rapidly. Richard stepped aggressively closer, his massive frame completely blocking the only path to the heavy mahogany door. Brenda moved to my left, her eyes flashing with manic desperation. Brittany flanked my right side, boxing me in. They moved like a pack of starving wolves, cornering their prey, stripping away any illusion of safety. The air in the library became heavy and stifling. Richard suddenly lunged forward. His large, rough hand grabbed my right wrist with a bruising, violent force. I tried to pull back, but he shoved me hard against the edge of the mahogany desk. The sharp wooden molding dug painfully into my lower spine, trapping me in place. With his free hand, Richard snatched a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from the desk organizer. He slammed the pen down into my open palm, his fingers crushing mine around the cold metal barrel. "Sign the paper, Caroline." Richard growled, his face so close I could feel his hot, angry breath against my cheek. "Sign your life away right now, or we will destroy you before the sun comes up." The cold metal of this gold-plated fountain pen pressed hard against my palm. Richard tightened his crushing grip around my fingers, attempting to physically force my hand down toward the signature line of the fraudulent promissory note. His breathing was heavy, ragged with the exertion of his own panic and malice. He honestly believed that brute strength and psychological terror could bend me to his will. He thought the 34 years of emotional conditioning he and Brenda had subjected me to would automatically trigger my submission. I did not fight his physical strength. I did not try to wrestle my arm away from his massive frame. Instead, I simply relaxed my hand completely. I let my fingers go entirely limp. The heavy gold pen slipped right through my open grasp, tumbling downward. It hit the solid mahogany desk with a sharp, loud clatter, rolling over the damning federal document and coming to a stop against the edge of the glowing laptop. Richard froze, his chest heaving as he stared down at the discarded pen. A heavy, dangerous silence blanketed the dim library. "Pick it up," Richard growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal, barely contained fury. "Pick up the pen and sign the paper, Caroline. You are out of options. You are out of time." I lifted my chin and met his furious gaze with absolute, unyielding calm. "I do not negotiate with criminals," I stated, my voice echoing with the cold, measured authority of a courtroom magistrate. "And I certainly do not sign confessions for felonies orchestrated by desperate, failing men. You can threaten my job. You can threaten to call Human Resources. You can threaten to drag my name through the mud with fake psychiatric reports. Do your worst. But understand this very clearly. You are playing a game you cannot possibly win because you have no idea who is sitting across the table from you." Brenda let out a high-pitched sound of pure exasperation, throwing her hands up in the air. She is delusional, Brenda shouted, turning to Terrence with a frantic, pleading look. I told you she was unstable. She actually thinks she has some kind of leverage. We need to handle this right now before she ruins the entire evening. Brittany stepped forward, her expensive silk gown rustling aggressively against the floor. You are a pathetic, bitter loser, Caroline. She spat, her face contorting into an ugly sneer that ruined her flawless makeup. Terrence is giving you a chance to be useful for once in your miserable life. If you do not sign that paper, we will make sure you are locked up in a psych ward by Monday morning. You will lose your miserable little clerk job. You will lose your apartment. You will have absolutely nothing. Terrence chuckled, a dark, arrogant sound that filled the room. He took a slow sip of his bourbon, enjoying the spectacle of my family doing his violent bidding. I suggest you listen to your sister Caroline. The Jefferson family has a very long reach. If you try to fight this, I will crush you so completely that you will wish you had just signed the paper. They had drawn their battle lines. They had explicitly laid out their conspiracy, their extortion, and their intent to commit further fraud to silence me. The trial was over and the verdict was guilty. It was time for the sentencing. My right wrist was still throbbing from Richard's brutal grip, but my left hand was entirely free. Slowly, deliberately, I slipped my left hand into the deep, concealed interior pocket of my tailored black blazer. My fingertips brushed against a cold, solid object. It was heavy, carrying the undeniable physical weight of absolute authority. My fingers traced the smooth, raised edges of the solid bronze shield. I felt the engraved scales of justice, the intricate seal of the state of New York, and the bold, unyielding letters that declared my true identity to the world. It was my official judicial badge. For 10 years I had endured their relentless mockery. I had sat through countless agonizing family dinners, listening to Brenda and Richard belittle my career choice, laughing at my dedication to public service, and calling me a low-level paper pusher who lacked the ambition to make real money. I had allowed them to believe their own arrogant lies because my peace of mind was more valuable than their validation. But tonight they had crossed the line from toxic relatives to federal criminals. I gripped the heavy bronze badge firmly in my palm. The metal warmed against my skin. I prepared to pull it out of my pocket. I prepared to slam it down onto the mahogany desk, right on top of their fraudulent contract. I was seconds away from looking Terrence directly in his arrogant eyes and informing him that he had just attempted to extort a sitting justice of the New York State Supreme Court. I was ready to watch the color drain completely from my parents' faces as they realized they had stolen the identity of the one woman who possessed the unilateral power to sign their arrest warrants. I took a deep breath, tightening my grip on the bronze shield, ready to unleash absolute devastation. Before my hand could leave my pocket, a sudden thunderous sound shattered the tension in the room. Heavy, commanding footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor of the corridor outside. The steps were purposeful, rhythmic, and completely devoid of hesitation. Someone was marching directly toward the library. Terrence stiffened, his smug smile faltering slightly. Richard immediately released his grip on the edge of the desk, taking a nervous step backward. Brenda and Brittany froze in place, their heads snapping toward the heavy oak door. A voice rang out from the hallway. It was a deep, resonant baritone, rich with the undeniable gravel of absolute self-made authority. It was a voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms, silencing executives, and crushing opposition with a single sentence. Terrence, the voice boomed through the thick wood of the door, demanding immediate attention. Are you hiding in the study? Your mother has been looking for you for 20 minutes. The blood instantly drained from Terrence's face. The glass of bourbon in his hand trembled slightly. Richard let out a sharp, panicked gasp, his imposing demeanor vanishing into thin air. He looked like a terrified child caught stealing from a cash register. It was Warren Jefferson, the patriarch, the billionaire real estate mogul, the man who despised deception and demanded absolute perfection from everyone around him. The brass doorknob rattled violently. Brenda had locked the deadbolt from the inside, but the sheer force applied from the hallway made the solid wood groan in protest. "Open this door," Warren commanded, his tone dropping to a dangerous, impatient register. "I do not have time for games tonight." Richard scrambled away from me, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste to reach the door. His hands shook uncontrollably as he fumbled with the brass lock, desperately trying to slide the deadbolt back. The confident, abusive man who had just crushed my hand around a pen was entirely gone, replaced by a sniveling, desperate sycophant terrified of facing his wealthy investor. The lock clicked open. The heavy mahogany door was instantly pushed wide open from the outside. The bright, warm light from the hallway spilled into the dim library, cutting through the shadows and illuminating the fraudulent contract still sitting on the desk. Warren Jefferson stepped over the threshold, his imposing, broad-shouldered figure entirely filling the doorframe. He wore an immaculate, bespoke tuxedo, his silver hair cropped close, his dark eyes scanning the room with sharp, analytical precision. He had come looking for his son, expecting to find Terrence avoiding the crowd. Instead, he walked straight into a room thick with the undeniable stench of panic, hostility, and desperate criminality. Warren Jefferson did not simply enter a room, he invaded it. His mere presence demanded absolute submission. He stood entirely still in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking any route of escape. His dark, intelligent eyes swept over the scene with the terrifying precision of a predator assessing a chaotic landscape. He took in the overturned chair, the shattered glass of spilled bourbon on the rug, the heavy, erratic breathing of his son, and the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from my parents. "What exactly is going on in here?" Warren demanded. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a dense gravitational pull that forced everyone to freeze. "I was looking for Terrence to introduce him to the governor, and instead I find the groom locked in a study, surrounded by people who look like they were just caught robbing a vault." Terrence swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing against his stiff collar. He opened his mouth to speak, but the smooth, charismatic silver tongue that had just threatened me with federal prison completely failed him. For the first time all evening, the arrogant heir was entirely speechless. Richard, however, was a man accustomed to desperate survival. The sheer terror of losing his billionaire lifeline forced him into immediate action. He visibly shook off his panic, practically forcing his facial muscles to contort into a grotesque, fawning smile. He stepped away from the desk, waving his hands in a frantic, dismissive gesture. "Warren, please come in," Richard stammered, his voice dripping with a sickening, sycophantic eagerness. "I apologize for the disruption. This is nothing. It is just a minor family disagreement that got slightly out of hand. We were just finishing up." Brenda instantly caught on to Richard's desperate pivot. She smoothed down her expensive designer gown, pasting on a bright artificial smile that did not reach her panicked eyes. She glided toward Warren, attempting to exude the effortless charm of a high society matriarch, completely ignoring the fact that she had just physically assaulted me in a catering kitchen 20 minutes prior. "Oh, Mr. Jefferson, please forgive this dreadful scene," Brenda cooed, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "We are so embarrassed you had to witness this. We were simply trying to handle a very unfortunate, very private family nuisance." Warren did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the center of the room, analyzing the bizarre dynamic. "A nuisance," Warren repeated flatly, his tone indicating he did not believe a single word coming out of her mouth. "Yes," Brenda continued, her desperation making her reckless. She turned and pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at me. I stood against the edge of the mahogany desk, the stained, wet catering apron still tied tightly around my waist. My black dress was ruined with water and cocktail sauce. I looked exactly like the lowly servant she wanted me to be. Brenda leaned closer to Warren, lowering her voice as if sharing a disgraceful secret. "That is our eldest daughter, Caroline. She is the black sheep of this family. She has always been incredibly unstable and bitterly jealous of Brittany. She works a pathetic minimum wage job, and she showed up tonight uninvited, demanding money and throwing a massive tantrum because she cannot stand to see her younger sister marrying into such a prestigious, wealthy family like yours. Brittany immediately seized the opportunity to play the victim. She stepped forward, clutching her hands to her chest, her lower lip trembling in a flawless performance of distress. "It is true, Mr. Jefferson. Caroline is completely unhinged. She cornered us in here. She threatened to ruin my entire wedding if we did not pay her off. We were just trying to contain her so she would not go out there and cause a scene in front of your wonderful guests. We are so sorry." Richard nodded vigorously, stepping beside his wife and golden child to form a unified front of deception. "We had to discipline her, Warren. We had to put her in her place. She is nothing but a spoiled, ungrateful girl who thinks the world owes her a living. Please let us escort her out the back door, and we can all return to the celebration." Terence used the distraction of my family's frantic lies to slowly, discreetly reach behind him. His fingers brushed against the mahogany desk, attempting to slide the fraudulent promissory note under a leather blotter before his father could notice the federal crime sitting in plain sight. I saw his movement, but I did not react. I did not need to. Warren Jefferson was not a man who amassed a billion-dollar real estate empire by listening to the frantic lies of desperate, failing logistics managers. He was a man who read people for a living. He ignored Brenda cloying apologies. He ignored Brittany fake tears. He ignored Richard pathetic groveling. His sharp dark eyes bypassed the entire theatrical performance and landed squarely on me. I did not shrink under his intense scrutiny. I did not cower, and I certainly did not attempt to explain myself to a room full of criminals. I stood perfectly straight, my posture reflecting the absolute unyielding authority I carried every single day in the courtroom. I met the billionaire gaze with a cool, clinical, and entirely fearless stare. I watched the gears turning behind Warren Jefferson's eyes. I watched him process the stained apron, the wet clothes, and the hostile accusations hurled by my parents. Then I watched him process my face. Warren was a titan of industry who remembered every single detail of his empire. He remembered every contract, every rival, and every courtroom battle. 2 years ago, his entire holding company had been targeted by a massive, highly sophisticated corporate espionage ring. His competitors had attempted to bury him under a mountain of fabricated evidence. The case had landed on my docket. For 6 grueling weeks, I presided over that trial. I dismantled the false testimonies. I exposed the fraudulent accounting. I delivered a ruling so absolute and legally impenetrable that it saved Jefferson Global Holdings from total annihilation. Warren Jefferson knew exactly who I was. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The commanding, impatient scowl on his face evaporated instantly. The terrifying patriarch of the Jefferson family stopped dead in his tracks. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Richard's sycophantic smile froze on his face. Brenda's hand dropped slowly to her side. Brittany stopped her fake sniffling. Even Terence froze, his hand still hovering over the desk. Warren Jefferson did not yell. He did not ask any questions. He simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating physical distance between himself and my parents. Then the billionaire titan lowered his head, placed his right hand firmly over his heart, and bowed with profound, undeniable reverence. "Your Honor." Warren Jefferson said, his voice echoing with a profound respect that seemed to shake the very foundation of the mahogany library. The words hung in the stifling air of the room, heavy and undeniable. Warren did not move from his reverent posture. He kept his hand pressed firmly against his chest, completely ignoring the frantic, sweating figures of my parents who were standing just feet away. "I sat in your courtroom exactly 2 years ago." Warren continued, his tone filled with absolute sincerity. "I watched you systematically dismantle a syndicate of corrupt executives who tried to bury my entire life of hard work under a mountain of fabricated evidence. You saw through their highly paid defense teams. You saw through the fraudulent accounting. Thanks to your fair and absolute ruling, my corporation was saved from complete destruction. You protected the livelihood of thousands of my employees. I owe you a debt of gratitude I can never fully repay. He slowly lifted his head, his dark, perceptive eyes finally taking in the full visual absurdity of the scene before him. He looked at the cocktail sauce staining my tailored black dress. He looked at the cheap, wet catering apron tied tightly around my waist. He looked at the raw, red marks on my wrist where my father had brutally grabbed me just moments prior. The billionaire patriarch frowned genuine confusion, furrowing his brow. I do not understand, Warren said, his voice dropping to a low, demanding register. You are one of the most powerful and respected judicial figures in the state of New York. Why are you standing in this house wearing a soiled catering apron? The silence that followed his question was absolute. It was a dead, suffocating vacuum. All the oxygen was instantly sucked out of the room. The faint, cheerful sounds of the jazz quartet playing out on the terrace felt like they belonged to an entirely different universe. Brenda was the first to physically react. The arrogant high society matriarch who had just threatened to destroy my life took a stumbling, unsteady step backward. The heel of her expensive designer shoe caught on the edge of the Persian rug, and she nearly collapsed into the bookshelf. Her jaw dropped open, her eyes widened to the point of sheer madness. She stared at me, then at Warren, and then back at me. Her brain was completely short-circuiting, desperately trying to process the impossible combination of the words, Your Honor, and the daughter she had treated like a miserable servant for 34 years. Your Honor. Brenda mouthed silently, her lips trembling. The terrifying reality was crashing down on her like a freight train. The low-income government clerk she had locked in a kitchen, the spinster she had ruthlessly mocked in front of her wealthy guests, was a Supreme Court justice. Brenda had just committed physical assault and attempted extortion against a sitting magistrate. Richard looked like he was experiencing a massive cardiac event. The blood entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His massive shoulders slumped forward. His knees physically buckled, forcing him to lean heavily against the edge of the mahogany desk, just to remain standing. The man who had just crushed a heavy gold pen into my palm, attempting to force my signature on a fraudulent federal contract, suddenly realized the apocalyptic magnitude of his mistake. He had not cornered a helpless paper pusher. He had cornered the exact judge who possessed the unilateral authority to sign his federal arrest warrant. Brittany stood frozen, her $10,000 custom gown suddenly looking like a cheap, ridiculous costume. Her entire worldview was violently shattering into pieces. She had spent her entire life believing she was the golden child, the superior daughter destined for greatness, while I was the pathetic family embarrassment. Now the billionaire father-in-law she worshipped, the man whose approval she desperately craved, was bowing in deep reverence to the sister she had just commanded to wash dirty dishes. The psychological devastation on her face was absolute. Her arrogant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a vacant, horrified stare. But the most spectacular collapse belonged to Terrence. The charismatic, predatory groom who had orchestrated this entire financial conspiracy slowly lowered his hand. He placed his crystal glass of bourbon onto the desk, his fingers shaking so violently that the ice cubes rattled against the glass. He had bypassed federal compliance regulations. He had authorized a fraudulent $500,000 commercial bridge loan. He had attempted to blackmail his future sister-in-law to secure a compliant, subservient family of in-laws. Terrence realized in that exact moment that he had not blackmailed a random civil servant. He had blackmailed the very judge who governed commercial fraud cases in the state of New York. He had used his father's private equity fund to commit a felony against a magistrate who possessed the power to freeze his assets, subpoena his communications, and send him to a federal penitentiary for decades. The trap he had so brilliantly designed for my parents had just snapped shut around his own neck. I did not move. I stood perfectly still against the edge of the desk, my posture radiating the unwavering clinical authority of the courtroom. I let the agonizing silence stretch. I let them marinate in the sheer, unadulterated terror of their own making. The power dynamic in the library had fundamentally and permanently shifted. The predators who had boxed me in, threatening to destroy my career and commit me to a psychiatric ward, were now completely paralyzed. They were trapped in a room with a billionaire who despised deception and a Supreme Court justice who held all the evidence of their massive, coordinated fraud. Warren Jefferson looked away from my apron and turned his sharp, analytical gaze toward the terrified faces of my parents and his son. His eyes narrowed, taking in the fraudulent promissory note sitting in plain sight on the desk, right next to the glowing laptop screen that still displayed the Federal Lending Registry. The atmosphere in the room shifted from shock to a cold, creeping dread. The scene was perfectly set, the players were exposed, and the terrifying calm before the storm had officially arrived. The heavy silence following Warren Jefferson's bow was finally shattered by a sound that resembled a dying animal gasping for air. It was Brenda. Her mind, perfectly conditioned by decades of narcissism and delusion, absolutely refused to process the reality unfolding in front of her. The psychological dissonance was too massive. In her rigid, class-obsessed universe, I was the pathetic, underachieving disappointment. I was the stain on their perfect family portrait. The idea that I commanded the respect of a billionaire titan was not just improbable to her, it was entirely impossible. "Mr. Jefferson!" Brenda stammered, her voice pitching into a shrill, hysterical frequency. Her hands fluttered wildly in the air as if she could physically wave away his words. "You are mistaken. You have confused her with someone else. I assure you there is a massive misunderstanding here." Warren slowly straightened his posture. The reverent expression on his face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. He turned his sharp gaze toward my mother, his dark eyes narrowing with lethal precision. "I do not make mistakes, Brenda," he stated, his voice resonating with a quiet, terrifying danger. "And I certainly do not forget the face of the magistrate who saved my life work from total ruin." "But she is just a clerk!" Brenda shrieked, desperation driving her completely reckless. She took a frantic step toward Warren, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "Look at her! Look at how she is dressed! She makes a miserable public salary. She stamps forms in a cubicle. She does not even own a decent car. She has lied to you. She must have lied to you to make herself look important." Richard grabbed his wife's arm, trying to pull her back, his face a portrait of absolute terror. He had seen the Federal Financial Registry on the laptop. He knew the truth. But Brenda yanked her arm free, blinded by her desperate need to maintain the illusion of her own superiority. "She is a nobody!" Brenda yelled, her voice echoing off the mahogany bookshelves. "I am her mother. I know exactly what she does. She is a low-level secretary." Warren Jefferson's posture expanded, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the entire room. He took one step toward Brenda, and the sheer force of his presence forced her to stumble backward. "Do you take me for a fool?" Warren roared, his voice hitting the room like a thunderclap. "Do you think a man who built a global empire cannot recognize the most formidable legal mind in this state?" Brenda flinched, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. "The woman standing behind you is not a clerk," Warren declared, his tone laced with absolute disgust for my mother's ignorance. "She is the Honorable Caroline. She is a sitting justice of the New York State Supreme Court, presiding over the commercial division. She wields the unilateral authority to freeze corporate assets, liquidate multinational conglomerates, and sentence corrupt executives to federal prison. She is the most powerful, brilliant, and incorruptible woman in the New York judicial system." The words hit the room with the destructive force of a wrecking ball. Supreme Court Justice. The title hung in the air, radiating an untouchable, terrifying power. I watched the exact second my family's entire universe shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Brenda's face drained of all color, leaving her skin a sickening, translucent white. Her knees gave out and she collapsed against the edge of the leather sofa, her hands gripping the armrest to keep from hitting the floor. The staggering realization that she had spent 34 years treating a Supreme Court justice like a worthless maid finally fractured her mind. She had locked me in a kitchen. She had thrown my government-issued phone into a sink. She had physically assaulted me. Brittany's reaction was even more catastrophic. The golden child, the flawless bride who believed she was ascending to the throne of high society, suddenly realized she was nothing but a fragile, pathetic illusion. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a horrified, vacant stare. The sister she had just ordered to wash dirty appetizer plates possessed more power, more wealth, and more genuine respect than Brittany could ever achieve in 100 lifetimes. A sharp, ragged sob tore from Brittany's throat. Her legs completely gave way. She collapsed onto the expensive Persian rug, the heavy silk of her $10,000 designer gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She dropped to her knees, staring at the floor, her hands trembling violently. The arrogant, cruel smirk that had defined her entire existence was permanently erased. She was ruined, and she knew it. Terence stood frozen by the desk, his face slick with cold sweat. The arrogant groom who thought he could use his father money to buy a compliant family now realized he had actively committed federal wire fraud against a magistrate who could sign his arrest warrant without blinking. He looked at his father, then at the glowing laptop screen, and finally at me. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending incarceration. The time for silence had passed. The stage was perfectly set. I stepped away from the edge of the mahogany desk. The heavy, humid air of the room parted around me. I reached behind my back, my fingers finding the tight knot of the stained, wet catering apron Brenda had forced me to wear. With a single sharp pull, I untied the strings. I pulled the cheap white fabric over my head. I did not fold it. I did not hand it back to my mother. I simply let it drop from my fingers. The apron hit the hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic thud, leaving me standing in my tailored black dress. It was ruined with water and cocktail sauce, but I wore it like absolute armor. I reached into the deep concealed pocket of my blazer, my fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy bronze of my official judicial shield. I pulled my hand out, gripping the metal tightly. I raised my arm and slammed the solid bronze badge down onto the center of the mahogany desk. The sharp, violent crack of metal striking wood echoed through the library like the deafening strike of a gavel. The shiny gold seal of the state of New York gleamed under the desk lamp, resting inches away from their fraudulent promissory note. The sharp clack of the bronze shield hitting the wood severed whatever remaining delusion my family harbored. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. When you possess absolute power, a whisper is more deafening than a scream. The catering apron lay crumpled on the floor, an artifact of a life I would never be subjected to again. I looked directly at Warren Jefferson. I met the gaze of the billionaire patriarch not as a prospective family member seeking approval, but as a magistrate presenting the irrefutable facts of a federal indictment. "It is good to see you again, Mr. Jefferson," I said, my voice echoing with the clinical, unyielding cadence I used to deliver sentences from the bench. "I only wish this reunion was under better circumstances. Unfortunately, I am not here to celebrate your son getting married. I am here because I just walked into an active, highly coordinated crime scene." Warren's posture shifted instantly. The reverent warmth in his dark eyes vanished, replaced by the ruthless analytical calculation of a man who destroyed empires for a living. He looked at the bronze judicial badge, then at the glowing laptop screen displaying the federal registry, and finally back to my face. He recognized the gravity of my tone. He knew a Supreme Court justice did not use the phrase crime scene lightly. "Explain," Warren commanded, his tone dropping to a dangerous gravelly register that made the mahogany walls seem to vibrate. I pointed a steady accusatory finger at Richard. My father was currently trembling against the edge of the desk, clutching his chest as if his heart was about to give out. Sweat poured down his forehead, ruining the collar of his stolen tuxedo. 21 days ago, the man cowering beside you committed aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud," I stated, delivering the verdict with flawless surgical precision. "Richard and Brenda are completely bankrupt. Their logistics company has been entirely insolvent for 2 years. To maintain the illusion of wealth and secure a marriage into your prestigious family, they stole my social security number. They bypassed federal lending regulations and secured a commercial bridge loan for $500,000. Brenda let out a muffled, pathetic whimper from the leather sofa. She did not dare deny it. She was physically incapable of speaking, suffocating under the weight of her exposed deception. Warren's jaw clenched tightly. The thick muscles in his neck tightened as the reality of my words began to penetrate his razor-sharp mind. A commercial loan, he repeated slowly, the words dripping with suspicion. From which institution? That is the most fascinating part of this entire conspiracy. I continued, keeping my eyes locked with his. They did not defraud a random commercial bank. They did not go to a standard lending agency. They specifically targeted your private equity firm. The $500,000 currently funding the imported champagne, the jazz quartet, and the custom designer gown my sister is wearing all came directly from the treasury of Pinnacle Horizon Capital Partners. The air in the library turned into solid ice. Warren Jefferson, a man who built his legacy on absolute financial security and ruthless vetting protocols, had just been robbed by the very people drinking his expensive wine in the next room. He had been played for a fool by a pair of desperate, failing suburban socialites. But I was not finished. The true magnitude of the betrayal had yet to be revealed. The real architect of this disaster was still standing in the shadows. Your future-in-laws are desperate, incompetent criminals, I said, my voice hardening into a lethal weapon. But they are not smart enough to bypass the compliance department of a billion-dollar investment fund on their own. They had inside help. They had high-level executive authorization. I turned my gaze away from my terrified parents. I shifted my focus to the corner of the room, fixing my eyes on the charismatic, predatory groom who was currently sweating through his custom-tailored suit. Terrence stood completely paralyzed. His hands were gripping the edge of the wooden bookshelf so tightly his knuckles were stark white. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows, waiting for the heavy lever to be pulled. Warren followed my gaze. He looked at his own son. Terrence knew exactly how bankrupt they were. I declared, driving the final nail into the coffin of their massive conspiracy. He orchestrated the entire fraud from the inside. He instructed Richard on how to forge the documents. He personally bypassed your strict underwriting protocols and pushed the unverified loan through compliance. He handed $500,000 of your corporate funds to a failing businessman. Why? Warren demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that shook the glass panes in the mahogany doors. Why would my own son authorize a fraudulent unsecured loan to a bankrupt logistics company? For absolute control, I answered, exposing the deep psychological rot at the core of Terrence's plan. Terrence did not want an equal partnership in this marriage. He wanted a compliant, subservient family of in-laws that he could manipulate at will. By holding a fraudulent federal loan over their heads, he effectively bought them. He turned my parents into his obedient puppets. If they ever stepped out of line, he possessed the leverage to send them to federal prison. I reached over and picked up the thick, legally binding promissory note sitting next to my judicial badge. I held it up high so Warren could see the bold, predatory clauses printed on the heavy parchment paper. 10 minutes ago, Terrence and my family locked me inside this library, I said, my tone radiating a cold, destructive fury. They cornered me like an animal. My father physically assaulted me, bruising my wrist. They attempted to force me to sign this confession of debt. They wanted to legally shackle me to their fraud so Terrence could maintain a flawless paper trail for your internal auditors. When I refused to comply, your son threatened to use the entire Jefferson legal team to destroy my career, ruin my reputation, and have me locked in a psychiatric ward. I tossed the fraudulent contract back onto the desk. It landed with a soft, damning slap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Your son attempted to extort a sitting justice of the New York State Supreme Court. I concluded, delivering the final catastrophic blow. He used your money to build a criminal enterprise, and he used your powerful name to threaten a federal magistrate with complete ruin. The silence that engulfed the library was profound. It was the devastating, heavy quiet of total annihilation. The intricate, toxic web of lies, extortion, and financial crimes had been completely dismantled and laid bare under the harsh, unforgiving light of absolute justice. I had delivered my ruling. There was no defense attorney to object. There was no jury left to deliberate. Warren Jefferson stood motionless in the center of the room. He absorbed every single word I had spoken. He processed the stolen funds, the bypassed security protocols, the violent extortion, and the sheer, arrogant stupidity of the man he had trusted to inherit his empire. The billionaire titan slowly turned his head. He shifted his gaze away from the desk, away from my shivering parents, and locked his eyes directly onto Terrence. The look on Warren Jefferson's face was devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the dark, lethal, and absolutely terrifying glare of a father and a business mogul who had just been profoundly and unforgivably betrayed. The silence in the library was brittle, stretched to its absolute breaking point. Terrence pressed his back against the mahogany bookshelves, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. The arrogant billionaire heir who had just threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified boy, desperately trying to construct a defense under the lethal, suffocating glare of his father. "Dad, you have to listen to me," Terrence stammered, his voice cracking. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "I did this for our family. I did this to protect the Jefferson legacy. Look at these people. Look at Richard and Brenda. They are desperate, greedy leeches. They would have bled our accounts dry the moment I married Brittany. I had to put them on a leash. I used the bridge loan to guarantee their absolute submission. It was a strategic business move. I was protecting our assets." Warren Jefferson did not blink. His broad chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. Every second he remained silent seemed to drain another ounce of oxygen from the room. "A strategic business move." Warren repeated the words rolling off his tongue like shards of broken glass. "You bypassed my internal compliance team. You falsified underwriting documents. You committed federal wire fraud using my corporate treasury. And you did all of this to extort a sitting justice of the Supreme Court." Terrence lunged forward, grabbing his father's sleeve. "I did not know who she was. I swear I did not know she was a judge. If I had known, I never would have touched her identity. We can fix this. We can pay off the loan and make this whole thing disappear." The strike was so fast and so violently powerful that it blurred my vision. Warren Jefferson swung his heavy arm in a devastating arc. The back of his hand collided with Terrence's jaw with a sickening percussive crack. The sheer force of the blow lifted Terrence off his feet. The heir to the Jefferson Empire was thrown violently backward, crashing over the edge of the leather sofa and collapsing in a tangled, pathetic heap on the Persian rug. A sharp scream ripped from Brittany's throat. She clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror as she watched her billionaire groom spit blood onto the floor. Brenda pressed herself flat against the wall, entirely paralyzed by the sudden eruption of physical violence. "You do not fix a federal crime," Warren roared, his voice shaking the crystal glasses on the bar cart. "I built Jefferson Global Holdings on 50 years of absolute, unshakable integrity. I fired men for expensing unapproved lunches, and my own son uses my company name to run a cheap suburban extortion ring. You are not a businessman, Terrence. You are a disgrace. You have jeopardized everything I built for a compliant, superficial bride." Terrence lay on the rug, clutching his bleeding jaw completely broken. The patriarch had delivered his verdict. I watched the scene unfold with absolute emotional detachment. The time for familial arguments and business lectures had officially expired. I turned my attention back to the massive mahogany desk. I reached out and tapped the trackpad of Richard's laptop, waking the screen from its sleep mode. "You all operated under a massive, fatal misconception tonight," I said, my voice cutting through the thick, terrified atmosphere of the library. My tone was devoid of any anger. It was the calm, chilling voice of a magistrate finalizing a sentence. Richard and Brenda snapped their heads toward me. Even Warren turned his gaze, watching me type a swift command into the secure federal portal. When my mother snatched my phone and threw it into the sink, you thought you had severed my connection to the outside world. I continued, my fingers moving rapidly across the keys. You thought locking me in this room and physically intimidating me would force my submission. You honestly believed that taking away a cell phone rendered a Supreme Court justice completely powerless. I hit the enter key. The screen of the laptop shifted instantly. The financial registry vanished, replaced by the stark, highly encrypted interface of the Department of Justice Emergency Dispatch System. The bold golden seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation illuminated the dark room. But my security clearance does not require a mobile device, I stated, turning the laptop around so the glowing screen faced the center of the room. I require only an internet connection and my secure hardware token. While you were backing me into a corner, while my father was crushing a pen into my hand, and while Terrence was threatening to ruin my life, I was not searching for an escape route. I was drafting a legal response. I pointed to the document displayed on the screen. It was not a draft. It was a finalized, digitally signed, and fully executed federal order. Richard let out a strangled, breathless gasp. He stumbled forward, his eyes scanning the bold, terrifying text at the top of the digital document. It was a federal emergency arrest warrant. This warrant charges Richard and Brenda with aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud, I read aloud, making sure every single syllable landed with maximum destructive force. It charges Terrence Jefferson with criminal conspiracy, financial fraud, and the direct extortion of a state judicial official. I bypassed the standard local precincts. I routed this directly to the Federal Cybercrimes Division. Brittany sank to her knees, the heavy silk of her $10,000 gown crumpling around her. She stared at the screen, her chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. The lavish engagement party she had demanded, the billionaire lifestyle she had sacrificed my identity to secure, was officially dead. She was not going to be a wealthy socialite. She was going to be the daughter and fiancée of convicted federal felons. I signed the electronic affidavit and authorized the deployment exactly 10 minutes ago, I declared, looking directly at Terrence, who was still bleeding on the rug. I transmitted the order before Mr. Jefferson even turned the doorknob to this library. The system logged the approval instantly. There is no reversing it. There is no settling this out of court. The justice system does not care about your zip code, your catering budget, or your real estate empire. The absolute finality of my words crushed whatever remaining hope they clung to. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of unbelievable arrogance, and I had just set the entire structure on fire. They were trapped. The walls had completely closed in. There was nowhere left to run, no lies left to tell, and no amount of money that could buy their way out of a federal indictment. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound sliced through the humid night air. The cheerful, upbeat music of the jazz quartet out on the terrace abruptly stopped. The loud, panicked murmurs of 200 elite guests began to swell outside the library doors. Then came the undeniable, terrifying noise that shattered the illusion of their high society world completely. The deafening, synchronized wail of multiple police sirens erupted from the street, growing louder and more aggressive as a fleet of federal vehicles breached the iron gates of the rented Hamptons estate. The synchronized wail of federal sirens did not just pierce the night air. It completely obliterated the carefully curated illusion of my parents' fraudulent empire. Piercing red and blue strobe lights slashed through the sheer curtains of the mahogany library, casting violent, frantic shadows across the faces of the people who had just tried to destroy my life. Heavy tactical boots hit the pristine cobblestone driveway outside. The commotion in the grand foyer escalated from confused murmurs to outright screams of panic. The elite of New York high society, the billionaires and socialites my parents had risked federal prison to impress, were now trapped inside an active crime scene. I calmly closed the lid of Richard's laptop. The sharp click of the screen shutting down was the final gavel strike on their freedom. Warren Jefferson did not spare another glance at his bleeding son on the rug. The billionaire patriarch adjusted his suit jacket, his expression carved from solid granite, and stepped out of the way. He was a man who understood the absolute power of the federal government, and he had no intention of interfering with the execution of justice. The heavy library doors were thrown wide open. 3 agents wearing tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stormed into the room. They moved with the swift, unforgiving precision of a unit executing a high-value raid. Richard tried to scramble backward, his hands raised in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Wait, there is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. "I am the host of this party. I am a respected businessman. You cannot just barge in here." The lead agent did not even pause to listen to his desperate whining. He grabbed Richard by the shoulder of his stolen tuxedo, spun him around with brutal efficiency, and slammed him chest first against the expensive mahogany bookshelves. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Richard's wrists echoed sharply in the room. "Richard, you are under arrest for aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against a federally insured institution," the agent recited, his voice booming with absolute authority. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." Brenda let out an ear-piercing, hysterical shriek. She scrambled off the leather sofa, her expensive evening gown twisting awkwardly around her legs. She completely lost whatever shred of sanity she had left. She lunged toward the agents, pointing her manicured fingers wildly in the air. "Get your hands off my husband!" Brenda screamed, her face flushed with a dark, ugly shade of crimson. "Do you know who we are? We are joining the Jefferson family tonight. We are throwing a $150,000 engagement party. You are making a massive mistake. I will have your badges for this. I will sue the entire department." 2 female agents stepped into the library, completely unfazed by her manic screaming. One of them grabbed Brenda's outstretched arm, twisting it firmly behind her back. Brenda gasped in shock as the cold steel cuffs snapped around her own wrists, pinning her hands together. "You are also under arrest for identity theft and wire fraud," the agent stated coldly, ignoring Brenda's frantic struggling. The agents marched my handcuffed parents out of the library and straight into the grand foyer. I followed closely behind them, the heavy bronze judicial shield still gripped tightly in my hand. I wanted a front row seat to their absolute spectacular downfall. The scene in the main hall was pure, unadulterated chaos. Over 200 guests were backed against the marble walls, their faces pale with shock. Crystal champagne flutes lay shattered on the imported tile floor. The expensive catered food sat abandoned on silver platters. The string quartet had long since fled the terrace. The lavish, extravagant party my parents had financed by stealing my future was completely destroyed. Brenda thrashed against the grip of the federal agents as they dragged her past the crowd of staring billionaires and corporate executives. She tried to hide her face, desperately attempting to preserve her shattered dignity, but the harsh flashing lights of the police cruisers parked outside illuminated her absolute humiliation for everyone to see. The high society friends she had desperately tried to impress were now pulling out their cell phones, recording the spectacular collapse of her fake empire. Richard kept his head down, sobbing quietly. The man who had proudly demanded I sign my life away was now crying like a coward in front of the entire New York elite. They were paraded out the front doors, shoved unceremoniously into the back of waiting federal transport vehicles, their fake wealth and arrogant pride completely stripped away. I stood near the grand staircase, watching the flashing lights illuminate the driveway. The suffocating weight I had carried for 34 years was completely gone. I was not the family disappointment. I was the architect of their reckoning. A sudden frantic movement caught my eye. Brittany tore through the crowd of stunned guests. Her $10,000 custom gown was torn at the hem, and her perfect elaborate hairstyle was a mess of tangled strands. She had watched her parents get dragged away in handcuffs, and the reality of her shattered future finally crushed her fragile, delusional mind. She did not run to me. She did not run outside to help her parents. She ran straight toward the library doors, desperately searching for the only lifeline she believed she had left. Terrence staggered out of the hallway, clutching his bruised and bleeding jaw. He looked completely disoriented, the reality of his own impending federal indictment paralyzing him. He was a man who had just lost his father, protection, his corporate power, and his freedom, all in the span of 20 minutes. Brittany threw herself onto the marble floor right at his feet. She let out a desperate guttural sob, wrapping her arms tightly around Terrence's legs. She buried her tear-stained face into the fabric of his expensive suit pants, clinging to him like a drowning woman grabbing a piece of driftwood. "Terrence, you have to do something!" Brittany wailed, her voice echoing shrilly across the silent, shocked foyer. Her tears ruined her expensive makeup, leaving dark, ugly streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. "You have to call your father lawyers. You have to use the Jefferson money to fix this. They are taking my parents away. They are ruining our wedding. Please, Terrence, you have the power. You can make this all go away. Save us. Please save us." The heavy silence in the grand foyer was only broken by Brittany's desperate guttural sobbing. She clung to Terrence's tailored suit pants, her knuckles white, her tear-streaked face buried in his legs. 200 of New York's most elite socialites, CEOs, and billionaires stood frozen against the marble walls watching the spectacle unfold. Warren Jefferson stepped out of the mahogany library. He moved with the slow, terrifying grace of an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. He looked down at his son, who was trembling, bleeding from the jaw and trapped by a hysterical bride. "Get up!" Terrence Warren commanded, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried across the cavernous room. Terrence flinched, trying to pry Brittany's desperate hands off his legs, but she held on with the manic strength of a woman watching her billionaire future evaporate. "Dad, please," Terrence pleaded, his voice cracking. "I can explain the underwriting process. I can fix the compliance breach. I will testify against Richard and Brenda. I will cooperate with the federal investigators. Just do not cut me out." Warren's expression did not soften. The patriarchal disappointment radiating from him was absolute. "You do not have a compliance breach to fix," Warren stated, projecting his voice so every elite guest in the room could hear the finality of his decree. "As of this exact second, you are no longer the director of investment for Jefferson Global Holdings. You are stripped of your corporate authority, your board seat, and your security clearance." Terrence gasped, all the color draining from his face. "Dad, you cannot do this. I am your son." "You are a liability," Warren corrected coldly. "You used my corporate treasury to run a fraudulent extortion scheme. You brought federal agents to my doorstep. I spent 50 years building an empire with an unblemished reputation, and I will not let a cowardly, entitled boy destroy it over a suburban bride. You are officially removed from the Jefferson Family Trust. You are disinherited, Terrence. You have nothing." The words struck Terrence like a physical blow. He staggered backward. He had just lost his title, his billions, and his entire identity in front of the most powerful people in the state. Brittany, entirely blinded by her own greed and denial, continued to wail. "Terrence, do not let him do this. You have your own money. We can still get married. We can hire lawyers to save my parents. You promised me this life. You promised me we would be untouchable." Terrence looked down at the sobbing, ruined woman clutching his legs. The realization hit him. Brittany and her fraudulent, desperate family were the anchors dragging him straight down to the bottom of the ocean. If he stayed attached to her, the federal investigators would tear him apart. He needed to sever the connection, and he needed to do it immediately, as brutally and publicly as possible. Terrence grabbed Brittany by the shoulders of her $10,000 custom gown. He did not pull her up to comfort her. He dug his fingers into the delicate silk fabric and shoved her away with a violent, repulsed force. Brittany shrieked as she was thrown backward. She slid across the slick marble floor of the grand foyer, her heavy dress tangling around her legs. She collided with the base of a towering floral arrangement, knocking a dozen white roses onto the tiles around her. "Get off me, you pathetic parasite!" Terrence yelled, his face contorting with a venomous, panicked rage. "Do not ever touch me again! Do you really think I am going to throw away my entire life for a fake bankrupt suburbanite? Your parents are federal criminals. You are a fraud. This entire party is a crime scene. Brittany stared up at him, her chest heaving, completely paralyzed by the brutal rejection. There is no wedding, Terrence declared, shouting to the entire room of stunned guests. The engagement is permanently canceled. The Jefferson family has absolutely no association with these criminals. I am done with you, Brittany. He turned his back on her, practically running toward the front doors to escape his father's wrath and the glaring eyes of the high society crowd. Brittany remained sprawled on the cold marble floor. The golden child, the favorite daughter who had been groomed for greatness, her entire life was utterly destroyed. Her parents were in the back of a federal transport vehicle. Her billionaire groom had just publicly discarded her like actual garbage. The 200 elite guests she had wanted to impress were now pointing their phones at her, recording her spectacular downfall. Her dream of endless wealth had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Then her frantic, bloodshot eyes darted across the foyer. She saw me. I was standing near the grand staircase, my posture perfectly straight, my black dress stained, but my aura radiating absolute untouchable authority. I still held the heavy bronze judicial shield in my hand. A sudden delusional spark of hope ignited in Brittany's eyes. She remembered the power I held. She remembered the federal agents addressing me with respect. She scrambled onto her hands and knees, ignoring her ruined dress and her scraped skin. She crawled across the marble floor toward me, tears streaming down her face. Caroline, Brittany begged, her voice a hoarse, desperate rasp. Caroline, please. You have to help me. You are a judge. You have the power to stop this. You can call the FBI agents back. You can tell them to drop the charges against Mom and Dad. You can talk to Warren Jefferson. You can fix this. She reached out her trembling fingers, attempting to grab the hem of my dress. Please, sister. I have nothing left. I am begging you. Save us. I did not step back. I looked down at the sobbing, pathetic woman at my feet. I looked at the sister who had just thrown dirty appetizer plates into a sink, demanding I wash them or face ruin. I looked at the golden child who had told me my life was over, and I should gladly accept $500,000 in fraudulent debt as a wedding gift. I felt absolutely no pity. My face remained a mask of flawless clinical ice. I am not your sister, I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, final judgment. I am the Honorable Justice of the Supreme Court of New York, and the justice system does not grant pardons to arrogant, manipulative criminals. Enjoy cleaning up the mess, Brittany. I believe the catering staff is still missing a dishwasher. I did not wait for her agonizing scream. I turned my back on her and walked purposefully out the grand double doors of the Hamptons estate. The cool, crisp night air hit my face, clearing away the toxic stench of my former family. Waiting at the bottom of the cobblestone steps was a sleek, black armored SUV, its engine purring quietly. The federal marshals standing by the vehicle immediately opened the rear door for me, nodding respectfully as I approached. I stepped into the vehicle, the heavy armored door closing behind me with a solid, definitive thud, leaving the ruins of their fraudulent empire far behind in the rearview mirror. 72 hours after the federal raid at the Hamptons estate, I walked through the heavy reinforced steel doors of the Metropolitan Detention Center. The transition from the opulent, floral-scented air of a billionaire engagement party to the sterile, heavily sanitized atmosphere of a federal holding facility was jarring, yet profoundly satisfying. I did not wear a stained catering apron today. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit, my official judicial credentials secured in my leather briefcase. The federal guards at the security checkpoint stood a little straighter when they saw my identification, waving me through the metal detectors with absolute unquestioning respect. I walked down the long concrete corridors, listening to the heavy mechanical clanking of electronic locks, securing each sector behind me. I was directed to a private high-security visitation room reserved for legal counsel and high-ranking officials. The space was divided entirely by a thick pane of bulletproof plexiglass, a physical and metaphorical barrier separating the rule of law from the perpetrators of fraud. I sat down in the rigid metal chair on the visitor side, placing my briefcase on the narrow counter. I did not have to wait long. The heavy steel door on the inmate side groaned open. A federal corrections officer escorted a woman into the small concrete room. It took a fraction of a second for my brain to register that the shivering, diminished figure shuffling toward the glass was actually my mother. Brenda was utterly unrecognizable. The high society matriarch who had forcefully grabbed my wrist and threatened to destroy my entire existence just 3 days ago was completely gone. Her expensive, meticulously highlighted hair hung in greasy, tangled strands around her pale, unwashed face. Her flawless makeup had been scrubbed away during processing, revealing deep, dark bags under her frantic, bloodshot eyes. But the most striking transformation was her attire. The $10,000 designer evening gowns she so fiercely prized had been replaced by a shapeless, scratchy neon orange prison jumpsuit. It hung loosely on her frame, a glaring, inescapable badge of her criminality. Her wrists were shackled to a chain around her waist. She looked pathetic. She looked exactly where she belonged. Brenda slumped into the metal chair on her side of the partition. Her hands trembled violently as she awkwardly reached up with her restricted mobility to grasp the black intercom phone mounted to the wall. I picked up the receiver on my side, holding the cold plastic to my ear. I did not say a single word. I simply waited for her to speak. Caroline Brenda whimpered, her voice cracking through the static of the intercom line. The arrogant, commanding tone she had used to lock me in a catering kitchen had vanished, replaced by a desperate, guttural sob. "Caroline, please, you have to get me out of here. They took my fingerprints. They took a mugshot. The food is inedible and the guards treat me like an absolute animal. I cannot sleep on that concrete bed. You have to talk to the federal prosecutor. You have to tell them this was all a massive misunderstanding." I kept my expression entirely neutral, letting her frantic pleading wash over the thick glass without absorbing an ounce of her panic. "You are a Supreme Court justice." Brenda continued, pressing her chained hands flat against the plexiglass, as if she could somehow reach through and shake me into submission. "You have power. You have connections in the government. You can make a few phone calls and have these charges dropped immediately. Tell them Richard forced me to do it. Tell them I did not know about the fraudulent signatures on the commercial loan. You are my daughter. You have to save me. We are family." The sheer, unadulterated delusion of her demands was breathtaking. Even sitting in a federal detention center facing decades in a maximum security prison, she honestly believed I would sacrifice my judicial oath, my spotless career, and my own freedom to protect her fragile, shattered ego. She thought she could still manipulate me. I looked directly into her red, swollen eyes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt absolute, unshakable clarity. "You gave up the right to call me your daughter the exact second you stole my social security number to fund a fake billionaire lifestyle." I stated, my voice echoing through the intercom with the cold, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. "You gave up that right when you locked me in a kitchen, threw my government-issued phone into a sink, and threatened to commit me to a psychiatric ward to protect your massive federal crime. You did not care about family when you tried to saddle me with $500,000 of fraudulent debt." Brenda gasped, hot tears spilling over her eyelashes and tracking down her pale, unwashed cheeks. "But I am your mother," she cried out, her voice, a shrill, desperate rasp that echoed off the concrete walls. "You cannot just leave me in this cage to rot. I did it for Brittany. I did it so she could have a good life and secure a wealthy husband. We were just trying to survive. You were trying to buy your way into high society with stolen money," I corrected, slicing through her pathetic excuses with absolute factual reality. "You committed aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. Those carry mandatory minimum sentences in the federal system. You sacrificed my entire future to pay for imported caviar, a jazz quartet, and a party that ended with your future son-in-law publicly discarding your golden child. You made your choice perfectly clear that night." I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between my face and the bulletproof glass. I delivered my final verdict, ensuring every single word etched itself permanently into her shattered mind. My duty is to protect the law and uphold absolute justice, I declared, my voice dropping to a lethal, unyielding register. You chose an extravagant engagement party over my life, my career, and my freedom. You chose to be a calculating criminal. Now you get to wear a prison uniform instead of an evening gown. No, Caroline. Wait, please do not do this, Brenda screamed. She slammed her open palms frantically against the thick plexiglass, her face contorting in pure, unadulterated horror, as the reality of her long-term incarceration finally crushed her spirit entirely. You cannot just walk away. I am begging you. Do not leave me here. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stood up from the rigid metal chair, smoothing the jacket of my tailored suit with absolute calm. I looked at the screaming, desperate woman on the other side of the glass one last time. I slowly pulled the intercom receiver away from my ear, cutting off the sound of her frantic, begging voice mid-sentence. With a firm, deliberate motion, I slammed the heavy plastic phone down onto the metal receiver. The loud, definitive click severed the electronic connection instantly. I turned my back on the glass, picked up my leather briefcase, and walked out of the visitation room without a single backward glance, completely and permanently severing the blood tie forever. Exactly 365 days have passed since that spectacular federal raid illuminated the Hamptons estate with flashing red and blue lights. The wheels of the federal justice system grind slowly, but they grind exceptionally fine. Richard and Brenda stood before a federal judge who possessed absolutely zero sympathy for suburban socialites playing pretend with stolen identities. They attempted to secure a lenient plea deal. They tried to blame the failing economy of their logistics company. They even tried to point the finger at Terrence. The federal prosecutor dismantled their pathetic excuses in under 10 minutes. A jury of their peers found them guilty on all counts of aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. The judge handed down a mandatory sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. Their logistics company was completely liquidated to pay off furious creditors and mounting legal fees. Brenda now spends her days scrubbing the stainless steel tables in the prison cafeteria, wearing the exact same neon orange jumpsuit she wept over during my visit. Richard works in the prison laundry facility, earning 12 cents an hour washing soiled bedsheets. The high society friends they sacrificed my entire future to impress did not send a single letter of support to the courthouse. They were entirely erased from the elite world they so desperately craved, left to rot in concrete cells with nothing but the memory of their spectacular arrogance. Brittany did not go to federal prison, but the universe designed a perfectly tailored cage just for her. The golden child who once paraded around in a $10,000 custom gown learned a very harsh, devastating lesson about financial liability. When the federal authorities seized the fraudulent $500,000 loan and returned the stolen funds to the Jefferson corporate treasury, the vendors from the lavish engagement party were left entirely unpaid. The owners of the rented estate, the premium catering company, the jazz quartet, and the elite florists all filed massive civil lawsuits. With her parents incarcerated, the financial devastation landed squarely on the shoulders of the bride. Terrence vanished completely from her life. Warren Jefferson unleashed a team of ruthless corporate attorneys who ensured Brittany was permanently blacklisted from every luxury establishment and elite social circle on the eastern seaboard. Her billionaire dream was dead and buried. To avoid absolute bankruptcy and wage garnishment, she was forced to find immediate, grueling employment. Today, my former sister works double shifts as a waitress at a noisy, grease-stained diner on the outskirts of the city. Her pristine manicured nails are chipped and ruined by harsh dish soap. Her designer heels have been replaced by cheap, slip-resistant orthopedic shoes that ache after 14 hours on her feet. Every single day, she carries heavy trays of half-eaten food back to a humid, foul-smelling kitchen. She stands in front of a massive industrial sink, scraping congealed ketchup and grease off cheap ceramic plates. Customers snap their fingers at her demanding refills and treating her with the exact same dismissive cruelty she once directed at me. She is living the exact nightmare she tried to force upon me in that catering kitchen. She has no wealthy groom to save her, and no parents to fund her delusions. The poetic justice of her current reality is absolute flawless perfection. I do not check on them. I do not monitor their misery or gloat over their downfall. I simply let the natural consequences of their own malicious actions run their permanent course. I stepped out of the shadow of their toxic expectations and never looked back. The air in my life is finally clean. I wake up every morning in a beautiful sunlit penthouse that I purchased with my own legitimately earned wealth. I drink my coffee in total peace, surrounded by a chosen network of brilliant, supportive colleagues who respect my mind and value my presence. I walk into the majestic marble corridors of the New York State Supreme Court building every morning with a profound sense of absolute freedom. The heavy mahogany doors of my private chambers close behind me, shutting out the noise of the city. I stand in front of the tall gilded mirror and slide my arms into the heavy black judicial robe. The dark fabric settles over my shoulders, carrying the physical weight of absolute integrity and unyielding authority. I am not the family disappointment. I am not a lowly government clerk or a pathetic spinster. I am a self-made woman who protects the vulnerable and dismantles the corrupt. I walk out of my chambers and step into the sprawling wood-paneled courtroom. The bailiff calls the room to order, and every single powerful executive defense attorney and corporate titan rises respectfully to their feet the exact second I enter the room. I take my seat behind the elevated wooden bench, looking out over the silent, respectful gallery. Today, I am presiding over another massive commercial fraud case. A corrupt chief executive attempts to explain away a complex web of financial lies. I listen to his highly paid defense team spin their fabricated narratives. I see right through their desperate, transparent manipulation, just as I saw through the manipulation of my own blood relatives. I lean forward, interlacing my fingers, resting them on the polished oak of the bench. I deliver my ruling with cold, flawless precision, dismantling their fraudulent empire piece by piece. I watch the arrogant defendant realize that his wealth cannot buy his way out of my courtroom. I feel a brilliant, radiant warmth expanding in my chest. The heavy, suffocating burden of my treacherous family is completely gone. I severed the infected branches of my family tree and allowed myself to finally thrive in the sunlight. I reach out and wrap my fingers around the smooth wooden handle of my gavel. I look out at the courtroom, feeling the undeniable absolute power of a life lived entirely on my own terms. A genuine, satisfied smile spreads across my face. I raise the gavel high into the quiet air and strike the sounding block with a loud, definitive crack. Court is adjourned. The most profound lesson woven into this story is that biological connection does not automatically grant someone a free pass to exploit, disrespect, or destroy your life. For decades, society has pushed the harmful narrative that we must endlessly forgive those who share our DNA. However, this journey shatters that dangerous illusion entirely. True family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and unconditional care, not transactional value or superficial status. When relatives view you merely as a disposable resource to elevate their own egos or fund their delusions of grandeur, they completely forfeit the right to your loyalty. Another critical takeaway is the immense power of silent, self-made success. You do not need to constantly broadcast your achievements to validate your existence to those who belittle you. Building your independence quietly allows your success to serve as an impenetrable shield when ultimate betrayals occur. You never have to prove your inherent worth to people who are stubbornly committed to misunderstanding you. Furthermore, establishing ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate form of self-preservation. Walking away from toxic, manipulative environments is a deeply courageous step toward reclaiming your sanity and protecting your future. Finally, the story powerfully illustrates that malicious actions have unavoidable devastating consequences. You cannot build a luxurious life on a fragile foundation of lies, financial fraud, and the ruthless exploitation of others without eventually facing the catastrophic collapse of that very structure. Letting toxic individuals face the natural and legal repercussions of their own choices is not vengeful. It is simply allowing absolute justice to take its course so you can finally step out of their dark shadows and live a life of complete, unapologetic freedom. If you have ever had to establish firm boundaries to protect your peace from toxic relatives, share your empowering journey in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice and self-discovery.